Thanks for joining. We seem to have a quorum of 30 plus people on the call. My name is Glenn Schock. I'm Director of Alliances at Panzura, and with me we have Killian. Killian, go ahead and test your mic, say hi.
Hi everyone, thanks Glenn for having me on, I really appreciate it.
Thank you guys. So we are going to kick off this webcast. The purpose of this hour will be to go over Panzura as well as Varonis and talk about our new announcement of our joint integration work that we've done together and why it's important to you. So Cloud FS8 on Panzura, we call it Defend, now integrates completely with Varonis. So if you want to use both products together to have advanced threat detection and added security for your environment, that's what we're going to talk about today, is how Panzura's global file system works with Varonis, how we work jointly to detect and remove ransomware, and all things awesome about using cloud for your file system, as well as Varonis's capability of defending not only on premises, but cloud-based implementations against ransomware and everything security. Killian, would you like to add anything to that?
No, that was great. And we're just really excited to be partnering with Panzura here for this complete coverage of data protection across the organization. And then that's one of our goals, is to work with great companies like Panzura to make sure that wherever our customers are putting this data and they have their valuable information, we want to be there to work with them and protect it. So that's awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so who's Panzura? Panzura is the only hybrid multi-cloud unstructured data management platform with immediate global consistency. So what does that actually mean? You can access your data anywhere and really not have to worry about it. And the not having to worry about it part is where Varonis comes in and our joint integration work that we've done together. So what is it that we actually do? Panzura is an enterprise global file system. We're a software company and we develop these software filers at the edge. If you know your traditional NAS interface, such as NFS, CIFS, SMB, that's what we provide at the edge. But our back end is an object store. And that object store could be any S3 compatible object store in the cloud, such as S3, Google for GCS, Google Cloud Storage, Azure Blob, as well as RStore or Wasabi or MinIO. Or if you want on-premises object stores, we support Cloudian and we support IBM Cause. The goal of Panzura is to help your NAS get into the cloud age, right? So you can have on-premises filers, and we'll talk about what we do there, connected to an object store. It could be hundreds or thousands of miles away, but our technology enables you to feel at the edge like it's local IO, like it's local performance. And that's because our Panzura filer installs on a VMDK or via a VMDK or via Hyper-V on your HCI or servers that you have on premises. And we use CPU, memory, and a little bit of local NVMe storage for all of your local cache data. And when we do commits, we commit to the backend cloud. So what is neat about this technology? One, it is entirely a global file system. So if you have a set of data here in San Francisco, for example, you're going to see the same directory structure in New York. You're going to see the same directory structure in the cloud if you have a Panzura filer implemented in AWS or GCP or in Azure or in any cloud provider out there. So what we are able to do is if you drop a file in San Francisco, you're able to immediately open it for read, for example. Let's say it's a PowerPoint file. You're immediately able to open it in New York, or you can have access to it in the cloud. What does this really enable? It frees your data, right? It frees your data from just being in a silo on premises in one location to being usable in not only multiple locations, but giving that data access to all of the cloud native services that are available. So let's run through a couple scenarios of that. Let's say that you're a healthcare institution and you have a lot of biomed data that's being created. Traditionally, and also you have multiple sites, traditionally that data stays local to the patient record at one location. But what if you could also install Panzura filer in, let's say, Google Cloud and have that same biomed data stripped of all the HIPAA information thrown into a NoSQL database, run analytics, and then push that data back out. That's what we enable, is freeing up that data set to use cloud native apps to basically run analytics or AI or ML or computer vision or whatever's actually really interesting for your unstructured data set. Your unstructured data set is not only traditional files, but it could be IoT data, could be biomed data, could be security video data that you want to run through computer vision. A lot of different applications are available when you have a global file system in every location, as well as putting that same Panzura filer in any cloud out there or in multi-cloud. So how do we do I/O? When you drop a file in, we basically commit that immediately to backend object storage. But let's say that it's being dropped, and say I make a PowerPoint file and I drop it in San Francisco and it's a 10 meg file. When I hit close and somebody wants to open it up in New York, they'll go back to this Panzura filer and request the lock, right? So the lock will move and then they'll be able to open it up for read and write in New York. They can delete a slide, hit close, and then it's open. It's available to be opened again. Now, what's neat about the way that the Panzura filers commit data to the back end is we do non-destructive writes. And this is going to become more important as we go through this presentation. So every time we commit I/O to the back end, it is completely non-destructive. So let's go back to my 10 meg PowerPoint file. When I drop that in San Francisco, and I'm proud of it, and I make everybody aware of it, somebody's going to open it up in New York and let's say delete a file. Every change, and delete a slide. Every change is additive data. So my 10 meg file, even though somebody deleted a slide and it could be 9.5 megs now, that is an additional piece of information. Somebody makes an additional slide or changes a graphic, that's additional data, that's additional data, and that's additional data. So you can go back to any single point in time for that file. So here's what that effectively means for you. That means is you can right click on it if you support VSS, which we do. All right, so if you have a Windows machine, you can right click, hit properties, and look at every incarnation of that exact same file and go back to any point in time. So if you get hit with ransomware, what do? You have an encrypted new file. So let's say that my PowerPoint file became 11 megs in size after a year of being out on the file system. Then you get hit with ransomware. A new 11 meg file gets written, it's encrypted. All you have to do is go back to the previous point in time. And I'll show another graphic associated with that. So there's a lot of things that the Panzura filer does to ensure that your data is very secure. One is how we handle locking. All right, so we support two types of lock handling. If your application supports traditional read and write locks, such as PowerPoint or Excel or your traditional types of applications, we will migrate the lock for the entire file from one location to the other. If you have an application that supports byte level locking, such as AutoCAD or Adobe Premiere, we actually support byte level locking. What that means is, let's say I have an AutoCAD file open in San Francisco and I'm editing it. Somebody in New York double clicks on the exact same file, they can open it up for read and for write. When they open it up for read and for write, they can take a portion of it and make modifications as long as they're not in my same byte range. And again, this is supported at the application layer. So applications such as Revit, Civil 3D, AutoCAD, Adobe Premiere. And the nice thing is that no matter what the distance is between those two locations, right, between San Francisco and New York, the Panzura filers are in consistent communication with one another about how to handle those byte level locks. So not only are we a global file system, but we're also very conservative with how we handle our locking mechanisms to ensure that we never get corruption of our data sets. So again, this is a webinar about business resiliency. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's two types of resiliency that you should be concerned with. Number one is data loss. So that's deletions, corruption, and destruction. How do you traditionally recover from that? Deletions, if somebody deletes a file, you can go to the administrator and you can ask for that file to be recovered from tape or recovered from yesterday's backup if it's disk to disk backup, Or if your array does snapshots and that's recent, they can go in to that snapshot file system and then bring a file back. Corruption such as ransomware is a little bit tougher. You might have to do file system level snapshot recovery. And then destruction from a hardware failure, like a local NAS system failure, is very hard to recover from other than tape. And as we all know, tape becomes a little bit less reliable over time. The great thing about Panzura and the way that we interact with the backend object stores is that one, we do non-destructive writes. Two, we can recover to any single point in time for every single file because of those non-destructive writes. And three, our backend object stores, such as let's say Google or AWS or Microsoft, they replicate 3 ways within a region. You can even request them to replicate one of those 3 ways cross region. So let's say you're in East Coast, you can ask for Google to replicate 2 ways in the East Coast and then 1 into Central, for example. So that's something that's available within the cloud providers. So you don't really need to worry about one, offsiting your data because your data is inherently offsite. And 2, you don't really need to worry about backups because we save every incarnation of that file up to your retention period. So if you wanted to save up to 7 years or up to 20 years, all that's going to be available within the object store. Second, data access loss, right? What happens if you lose connectivity? Right? If connectivity is lost, we have multiple levels of HA within the Panzura filer to support access to that data set. Right? So even if you lose a site or if you lose connectivity to a site, all the filers will communicate with one another and then choose to move all the locks to what we call a global HA node so that all the other sites have the access to the locks that would have been lost had you lost an individual site. But keep in mind, you still always have access to the object store because the object store is in the cloud. And we also support something called cloud mirroring so that if an entire cloud goes down, then all of our Panzura filers will move over to the other cloud that is a backup. And that's basically a write split kind of technology. So these are interesting statistics about failure, right? So if you suffer a catastrophic data loss, high probability that you won't survive it, right, as a company. And these are costs associated with that from the University of Texas. The reason why we bring this up is because we want to ensure that you don't end up with ransomware. And the whole purpose of this webinar is to talk about how Panzura handles ransomware, how Varonis handles your security, and how well we've integrated them together. On the Panzura side, once you are attacked with ransomware and it infiltrates your environment, what happens when all of your data is already encrypted? So let's say it happened over a weekend and your data started to be encrypted and you show up on Monday and 80% of your NAS environment on a Panzura filer is encrypted. What do? All you have to do is recover to your previous point in time, pre-encryption, by simply either as an administrative level, basically going through all of your files, finding out when they got encrypted at a time level, and then just saying, okay, go back to the previous version, basically. And what happens is we get rid of that encrypted layer and then go back to the previous file, and it was like it was on Friday before you left. We also support the ability to do a file system wide level recovery. Let's say 100% of your files are encrypted. No matter what file you go to, you get that ransomware message across all of your files. You can just basically go back to the snapshot that existed prior to Friday. And something interesting to point out is, although quite a few of our customers have been hit with ransomware, 0 of them have paid a ransom for any data that was on a Panzura filer. Some of them have paid ransoms on data that was not on Panzura filer or was in a structured database or something like that. That's unfortunate. However, any data that was on Panzura was recovered within a day or within a week, depending on how much forensics the customer actually wanted to run through. Finally, what does this all lead to? A lower total cost of ownership, right? The reason why this leads to a lower TCO is because when you buy 1 terabyte of traditional NAS, you end up having to buy an additional 3 terabytes for remote replication, as well as for backups. Let's think about this. You buy 1 TB of traditional NetApp, for example, right? What do? Well, you want to remote replicate it. And you're going to remote replicate it to a system that maybe costs a little bit less than the original, but not much, because you need to have that capacity. And that's just for remote replication, which means it's off-siting of the data. But if you get ransomware at your primary site, guess what happens for the remote replicated site? Exactly the same thing, right? It's encrypted over there too. So how would you recover from that? Well, you need backups. So you need an additional 2 TB of local, let's say, data domain or Commvault or whatever you're doing for disk to disk to tape backups. You're going to have to buy at least 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 additional terabytes of capacity for that. With Panzura, because our customers don't have to do backups, because you can recover to any single point in time in the object store, and you're replicated to at least 3 object stores already, so you don't have to worry about remote replication. When you buy 1 TB, you're actually buying 1 TB. And that equates to lower cost of management, management, right? Ease of security, and finally, not having to buy additional workload, not having to buy additional capacity. So conservatively, we end up being about 1/3 the TCO of traditional NAS. Killian, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. That's really awesome to hear about your ransomware recovery strategy. And I think that's so critical because, as you know, we're seeing it time and time again. Organizations are getting hit with ransomware. And that's one of the key things that Varonis can help with as well, too, is offering that faster time to detection and faster time to response. So, on the scenario that Glenn gave us, hey, if you got ransomware hit over the weekend, Varonis could detect it, stop it in its tracks, and then you'd only have to maybe recover just a little bit with Panzura, and it'll be so quick and so efficient to get back up and running full speed, and not have to worry about coming in Monday morning and recovering everything. So that was really cool. Another part of it too that I'll get into is really some of the prevention. So securing the data in the organization down to that least privilege. But in terms of that, there are so many questions that organizations ask when they're trying to put this type of data security strategy in place. One of the big ones is, well, first off, is my data at risk? Just knowing where I have my sensitive data, if I can find it quickly and accurately, is it exposed to the wrong people? So we know it's protected on Panzer, and if you get that ransomware, it's going to come back and you'll be able to recover quickly. But knowing where you have data living out there that's maybe provisioned to the wrong people who have access to it. And how can I reduce that risk? How can I pull back that over permissive access without disrupting the business or breaking anything? Those are some key questions. On top of that is, how can I detect that breach? And we talked about some of the great ransomware recovery that Panzura has. But as we have people working, remote, coming in over VPN, maybe we'll start coming back into the offices, hopefully soon. Knowing what these individuals are doing, how they're connecting to the data, from where, from what devices, detecting if we have scenarios where advanced persistent threats are in the organization. And we've seen so many examples of these types of insiders, between the SolarWinds attack, the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities just last week. Last year, you can name the ransomware group Maze and so on and so forth, Emotet, all of these groups getting in and acting like insiders. How do we detect them very quickly and investigate those? So faster time to detection and, of course, time to response. And then, of course, time to recovery with Panzura. And then this one I kind of think is like a meta item between the two of them. Am I compliant? Where do I have these sensitive and regulated data in my environment? Can I prove it if an auditor comes and asks me for some documentation? Or could I fulfill a DSAR request if an end user or a customer comes and says, hey, tell me all the information you have on me across your databases, across your Panzura stores, helping to respond to those things quickly. And that's where Varonis really comes in. And we do that with our data security platform. And I'll walk through kind of the pieces of the components and how it fits together. So on the left-hand side, we have our enterprise data stores. And that could be anything across these platforms. So, if you're still running some on-prem traditional Windows file shares, of course, if you're running Panzura, if you're leveraging Office 365 at all, or SharePoint on-prem, Exchange on-prem, or if you have data in Teams, for example, which is also a meta platform, which is SharePoint Online and OneDrive really in the background. And then as organizations are coming in and out of the business using VPN, or if they're reaching out to the internet over DNS or web proxy, and then as they're authenticating to all of these resources with directory services. So we collect information from all of these platforms and all these resources, and we bring them into our analytics platform. And with that, we have some key components that we can mix and match together to solve those use cases I had previously mentioned. The first one is the user and group information, knowing who's at play in the environment, what accounts are administrators, what accounts are service accounts, who's an executive, for example. Having this type of context really helps make some determinations. Next up is the permission. So I know who's at play. Well, what do they have access to in the environment? Could Killian access or modify or delete documents on Panzura? What does that look like in SharePoint Online? Combining these platforms together to know that potential access. On the flip side of that is the content of the files. So we know who's out there, what the permissions look like, what data lives in those repositories and is sensitive, regulated. Do we need to comply with laws to prove who has access to it or restrict it down to least privilege? And then of course the access activity, knowing who's reading it, modifying it, where is it going, who's sharing it in the organization to answer those tough questions of, well, I know who can potentially get access to it. I know where my sensitive data lives. Well, who's using it? And is it being used for correct business purposes or the reason that we collected it? And then the bottom two are AD telemetry and perimeter telemetry. And these are super, super key. The AD telemetry tells us a lot about the organization. We're able to use that to baseline some of our processes and understand what users are accessing, what resources from where, what devices are they authenticated to, so we can build information around who they are to know if things are normal or abnormal. And then combine that with perimeter telemetry to know if we're coming in over VPN or spot signs of odd or anomalous behavior that could be related to APTs or malware, where we see like command and control channels over DNS or strange or odd behavior going out of the web proxy. With all these different streams combined together, we really help answer those core kind of cases I talked about, the data protection, the privacy compliance, and threat detection and response. So the way we do this, we kind of have a process that we go through in terms of gathering this information to make it actionable. So the first step is collecting the information from all of these platforms. We collect billions of events from all of these different data sources that we monitor. So if you're storing your data on Panzura, we have that audit trail coming in. We know the map of the permissions. We know the information about the classification. And then in addition to that, we have the Active Directory telemetry, the edge telemetry, and it's coming into our system. And this is all without an endpoint agent. So we're capturing all of this great raw data. And what we do is we're not just log collection. We take the information that we have and we enrich it. In the case where you have a username, the path of the file, things like that, the event time, that stuff that's typical logs, and that only gets you so far. What we do is with our analysis engine, we're learning about the user account. So we can tell if a certain account is, as I mentioned, an admin or executive, because they're going to have different behavior profiles than a regular user, for example. We have the classification stream coming in, so we know if an activity on a certain type of file needs to be scrutinized more, because we know if it's sensitive or regulated in the type of content. We also enrich the information with additional context about the device that users are coming from, not just the IP address information, because of course IP addresses can change. So what we do is we resolve that back to the device, so we know if the user logging in is on a typical or atypical device to help enrich the content. And then of course, if they're coming in over VPN or going something like Office 365, we have geolocation data as well too. So we can understand if the user's behavior and where they're coming from is typical with their device and with their location, and of course to the data they typically access. So we build a lot of context around every single event that we collect. And then we take that even further with the learning. So we use our AI platform with all of these events and all this additional context to create baselines or profiles of how these users act and behave. So for example, we have David Johnson here. We know he's an executive and he usually works from his machine, his normal typical laptop. He's based in the United States, so that's where we typically see his behavior coming from. And in this case, based on his role, he doesn't typically access customer data, but he might be provisioned to have access to it. And of course, we know his working hours. What that allows us to do is spot deviations from that. So if we see David's account logging in from a device that's typically associated with a different user or from an atypical geolocation, or if he's accessing data that he might have access to, but is abnormal for him or unlike his peers, we can spot these signs and help us identify cases where we might be dealing with a compromised account or an APT group or somebody inside the organization that's come in that is trying to use David's account or credentials inappropriately and we can take action to stop on that. We can alert the business, and then we can help remediate that, of course, and lock it down for the future. And this all starts, for us at least, with a risk assessment. So understanding what your organization looks like, what types of data you have out there, and we have a number of different flavors and varieties. So if you're concerned about remote work or insider threats or compliance, we absolutely have custom tailored assessments to help your organization map this data out. And again, as you're running a Panzura here, we can absolutely come in, we can work with you, can get that set up. Maybe we won't need the ransomware readiness one because it sounds like they got that one pretty good, but we should still be monitoring anyway. But kind of coming together with these platforms, we can give you that complete picture, and working with Panzura give you that peace of mind to know that somebody's watching your data, we're helping protect it, we're helping monitor it, and of course, helping you recover should something bad happen. Anything else to add, Glenn?
Other than the ransomware readiness helps because you guys are tracking files, right?
Absolutely.
And what's being hit, when they got hit, and it'll allow for a quicker recovery.
Absolutely, and that's the key that I think we want everyone to take away is, sometimes this bad stuff happens, no matter how we defend, but reducing the time to detection, and then of course the time to response, and bringing Varonis and Panzura together, I think would really fit that bill.
Absolutely.
I think that's all that I have in terms of my slides. I don't know if anybody in the audience has any questions, or we're taking questions.
Yeah. So it's awesome technology when working together, right? So you have the ransomware readiness capability from Varonis. They'll track from the Panzura filer, basically audit everything that's happening. So at the point in time at which you got hit with ransomware, you're able to go back into the Panzura filer and effectively go file by file through the known files that were modified. And it makes it very simple to recover from that versus guessing.
Exactly.
The question is, if you run a scan on the entire file system, does it have to pull everything down?
For the content classification?
I'm assuming so.
What we would do is we do go file level. So we look inside of the contents of every single file, and we can set up an architecture discussion. I think this is a little bit too technical maybe for this particular audience, but Varonis would look at every file on the platforms that we're monitoring to look at the content inside. So I don't know if we would have to pull it down and cache it locally on the endpoint devices in Panzura. That might be, as I mentioned, slightly too technical.
Is there a separate Varonis subscription required or included with Panzura? So Varonis is a separate software package, but the integration is included with the Panzura license. So if you already have Varonis, then the integration from Panzura is free. If you are looking at buying Varonis because this is interesting, then obviously, you have to talk to Varonis, and there's costs associated with their capabilities.
Yeah, there's also one about licensing on our side as well too. So Varonis's license is modular. It's per product and per module. So in this case, it would be licensed for like Windows or for NAS. For Panzura, would be a CIFS-based license for us. And then it depends on the modules you're interested in from there. There's the core kind of functionality modules, and if you want to add the classification or alerting, those are individual. We work with you on price on that. Typically, it's by monitored account that we're looking at in terms of licensing.
All right, we have another question that came in. So would you have to size your local filer as large as your entire store? So no. So our filers that are, I'm going to say yes and no, depending on your application. So there's two answers there. Generally, no. We size the cache at the edge at a very small percentage of the entire backend object store, because as you know, if you have 100% of your NAS data, 90% of it has been cold longer than a year. And then it varies to how cold the data is going to be locally, and how hot the data is going to be locally. So it's going to be a very small percentage of data is cached at the edge, usually less than 1%. And then the yes side of that answer is actually we support pinning data on our filers for specific types of applications. So imagine if you have research, you're doing research and you want to deploy Panzura filer on a research ship, right? And on that ship, you need to have a directory and a file system so that they can work locally with intermittent connectivity to the internet or any kind of network connectivity. You can actually pin data at the edge that will stay there forever. Then when connectivity is reestablished into the global file system, let's say you have two directories, one directory /ship, and then the other directory /import. So anything that you want brought into the ship or any data that you want them made aware of. So when the ship is not available to the network, people just drop data into the import directory. When it gets available, that import directory is available at the ship level, right? And then they can take all the data from it that they want and then cut the network again. This is a good application for research, for oil and gas, upstream oil and gas work as well. Or if for military types of applications, for like a forward operating base where you want to ship a hardened case and you have just local requirement for data with intermittent connectivity to the network. So you have a yes and no answer there. Generally, for enterprise types of deployments, our customers are not pinning data to the filer at the edge. So it's going to be less than 1% of local NVMe required to cache to give it that local feel. But keep in mind, all of the writes are committed local. And then every minute we're committing to the backend object store. So you have that local cache, but you also have backend object commits. All right, hopefully that answered the question. If we had data services, can we also use Varonis? So data services is informative. It is not competitive with Varonis. Varonis does a whole heck of a lot more than what Panzura Data Services does. Panzura Data Services is giving you information about our filer only. Varonis, if you have us, and then you have legacy NetApps, and you have everything in Microsoft Teams and Office 365, if you're in the cloud, they do a lot more than just Panzura Data Services. But if all of your data is just on Panzura and you're not in the cloud, you're not doing all that, then maybe, yeah, Panzura Data Services will give you a little bit of that auditing capability. But there's a whole heck of a lot more that Varonis has to offer outside of what PDS does. They're not really competing products.
I would echo that. I also see one here is Varonis running on the filer and scanning the traffic in real time. So I'm not entirely sure I understand that one, but we wouldn't install anything on Panzura if that is the thrust of the question. We would monitor it off device. So we're not like sitting in line with it or anything like that. So you won't have to worry about them going through us for performance impact and stuff like that.
Yeah, we're simply sending updates about access to the Varonis server. It's not running on the filer. So you basically point the Panzura filer to the Varonis server so that it just sends updates about who's accessing what file.
And then another one around the enumeration. So Varonis will walk the entire directory structure and we'll look at every file out there to scan them for content classification. Just, I think another person asked that question too.
It does a read. So it
Right.
doesn't pull anything down, it doesn't have to cache it. If the Varonis server is at the same place as your Panzura filer, then the data is there.
Yeah.
And it's happening in real time. So based on these questions, it looks like you guys get it, right? So Panzura, global file system, enterprise quality. We do non-destructive or immutable IO to the back end so that we can quickly recover from ransomware. But how will you detect that you've gotten ransomware? How will you detect which files were impacted? And how do you detect ransomware outside of a Panzer environment? Let's say you're with Office 365, Teams, or anywhere in the cloud. That's the value add that Varonis brings to the table.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's perfect.
If you have 10% local, so I'm guessing 10% locally cached in one area, let's say San Francisco, what about the other 90% of the data? The right way to potentially deploy Varonis would be as close to the data as possible. So if you put a VM in the same geo as the object store and put a Panzura filer there as well, you will have no egress charges for the Varonis server walking our file system, because a Panzura filer, let's say in Azure or in GCP, sitting next to a Varonis server in the same location, and then has the object store in exactly the same region, all three of which can communicate with one another locally, you will not have any egress charge impact whatsoever. That's my guess at the right architecture. Any comments on that?
Yeah, it depends on where we have the endpoint nodes at too. I think that's probably a conversation if there's some specific use cases that we want to take offline. We're absolutely happy to schedule that meeting in terms of that, because I'd have to review the particular architecture of the customer.
So none of your filers are 100% capacity of your total storage. Well, you need to build one. No, again, all of your storage is going to be at the backend object store. The filers at the edge are only going to egress from the backend object store the data that's requested by the users at that edge, or if you also consider cloud and edge point as well, only by the cloud native applications. So let's say you're multi-cloud, let's say your object store is in Google, but you put a Panzura filer into AWS for using AWS cloud native services, then the data that moves around will only be what is required by that end user. Okay? Hopefully that's used. If you do have any other questions, you can ping me at gshok, G-S-H-O-K, at panzura.com. Killian, do you want to give your information?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. So it's K Englert, E-N-G-L-E-R-T, at Varonis.com.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Glenn. Take care.